Chapter 71. Beginnings of the Secret Society, 9. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Yes, Madam Spirit, please leave everything to me. The bandit boss said while bowing, sporting a subservient expression. That's great, the lady disguised by Compass Carburetor nodded. Once everything is rounded up, I want your people to manage all the assets the underground had. The orphan children in the city know a lot. So, you can recruit them into your fold. We plan to expand the secret society throughout the Heroica Empire. Complete this first. I'll tell you the remainder of your role after a couple of days. Saying his piece, Compass Carburetor left, sensing through the mental energy stream from the bandit boss that he was willing to execute all the plans to the best of his abilities. Since he has maintained a bandit stronghold outside the city all along while neither being part of the underground or the city, it shows his intelligence. So, he'll do a great job at managing all the assets of the underground. Thinking as such, he smirked once, returning to their inn while accompanying Fielta and Kaithai. Once they arrived there, they removed their disguise and then ate like hungry monsters. Since they had expended a lot of Darlak each, they needed to replenish everything. So, for that, they had to eat enough food. Once they finished eating, they returned to the inn as Compass Carburetor said, detailing his next plan. There's a level 1 dungeon near this city. It hasn't ever been raided, so it has tremendous value. And, the three of us would be raiding it. It would be difficult, if not impossible. Kaithai frowned. You'll need an army of warriors and puppeteers to successfully raid a level 1 dungeon. And even then, there is no guarantee of success. Proceeding with only 3 people is a fool's errand. This is an infiltration mission, Compass Carburetor smiled. We'll first probe through the dungeon. And, once I determine the feasibility of my plan, we'll execute it. Fine, Kaithai nodded, sighing in return. If she hadn't seen just what Compass Carburetor was capable of, she would have refused adamantly. But, the way in which he manipulated people, affected their thoughts and emotions with a couple of actions made her understand that he was smart, rather smart at that. And, he was knowledgeable of the human psyche, able to take advantage of it through a variety of means. So, when Compass Carburetor said that he had a plan, they decided to follow it. After all, he only told them the bare minimum. The success of the plan hinged on his 2 system fragments. So, he didn't wish to tell his secrets to anyone, even his allies. Even though Fielta and Kaithai were his allies now, they were only following him due to Ephemela's orders. The moment she no longer had the patience to wait for General Artika would be the time she would retract her support. The moment that happened, Fielta and Kaithai would turn from allies to neutral parties. Moreover, it didn't end once he killed the slave harem system. He still had to look for other system users and hunt them down. All in all, he needed enough support to do whatever he needed. And for that to fruition, he needed the resources available in the level 1 dungeon. We'll rest for tonight and set off towards the dungeon tomorrow evening. Try to replenish as much of your Darlak reserves as you can in the meantime. Compass Carburetor said, returning to train some more while Fielta and Kaithai rested. He had already thrown his gun to the rooftop of a random house to recharge itself. This way, he'll have enough bullets to shoot while roaming the dungeon. And now, he focused, meditating as he noticed the changes in his mental energy form, realizing that he was close to upgrading his skills. The mental energy influx was steadily increasing in amount, causing him to be glad. After all, the symbol he had carved in the walls of every underground building was connected to him. And through that, the mental energy stream of anyone that thought while looking at them fell on him. This way, he was able to sense if there were any remnants of the underground that had survived. And the moment he sensed any mental energy streams filled with hatred, he headed to the roof of his inn, using the height to see from where the mental energy stream arrived, relaying the details to a bandit that had been posted on watch next to the inn. From there, the information was passed through the bandit network as they silently dealt with the remnants. It was an uneventful night after that as Compass Carburetor focused on training himself, finally sighing in relief, my Darlak has now reached 50. In the evening of the next day, Compass Carburetor, Fielta, and Kai exited the inn, slugging a bag each as they boarded a horse carriage and exited the city. They got down at a discreet location and motioned for the carriage to return. As the driver was one of the bandits, he silently complied. From here onwards, we'll be entering the territory of the Grogar. Compass Carburetor muttered, cautious as he observed all the mental energy streams incident on him, focusing further as he worked in not sensing them. After all, there were too many mental energy streams on him, preventing him from noticing if anything new landed on him. So, to avoid that, he had to first stop sensing the other mental energy streams. It wasn't hard since it only meant blocking part of his senses. And, as it involved the body of the money-making system in him, it was easy to switch it on or off. Soon, he didn't perceive any mental energy streams. Now, the moment a new mental energy stream landed on him, he'll be able to sense it immediately. Nav let's head in now. Compass Carburetor said, stepping foot in the forest terrain, immediately making eye contact with each other as they plucked many leaves from the area, slinging them into a fabric they had prepared for this expedition, creating a cloak that camouflaged them in the forest terrain. This way, noticing them would be harder than had they sauntered in normally. Chapter 72. Beginnings of the Secret Society, 10, you are listening at novelfull.audio. The cloak covered by the forest leaves helped them camouflage in the forest terrain, allowing them to move in stealth to a certain extent. The forest wasn't just filled with trees, but also had shrubs of various sizes and shapes. It was a dense overgrowth of a jungle, making even walking difficult. But, since there were just the three of them, they were able to walk somehow by slipping through the gaps between the trees. And since they had to tread through such terrain, they were light on their clothes, wearing a simple cloth that gave them basic protection against insects and thorns. That was all they wished to obtain since their priority was evasion. So, their clothes consisted of a whole fabric that covered them from head to toe, only keeping their eyes exposed. And they wore a simple pair of spectacles atop it as protection, allowing them to move unhindered without fear of insects crawling into their clothes and giving them hell. Forest insects were numerous and troublesome as heck. Hence, they took precautions against it first. As for the Grogar, they weren't judged to be as dangerous as the insects. After all, the moment a Grogar sensed them, Compass Carburetor would be able to notice the mental energy stream from them, sensing their position immediately. As for insects, it wasn't guaranteed since the level of their thoughts wasn't complex enough to generate a consistent mental energy stream. Compass Carburetor extended his index finger, watching an ant climb atop it and move over it for some time before climbing down naturally. All along, it hadn't emitted a mental energy stream. After all, to it, he was a colossal mountain of flesh that was beyond its scale of comprehension. So, it didn't even think of him as a whole, a reason it didn't generate any mental energy streams. So, this isn't an omnipotent ability. It does have its fair share of limitations. Compass Carburetor nodded, beginning to move through the forest terrain as he held an armament in both hands. There were a couple more armaments slung on his hip like keychains. He wished to be prepared for any situation. And, since the underground had a couple of interesting energy blades, he took them with him, intending to use them accordingly. Primarily for attack and defense, he had the two armaments, each with 3 states, gifted by Ephemerella. Other than that, he had 3 other armaments, each of which had 1 state each. They were useful for a variety of situations. So, he brought them with him. Fielta and Kai too brought 3 more armaments each from the arsenal of the underground. There was no reason not to use helpful tools for their mission. After they traveled for around 30 minutes, Compass Carburetor suddenly raised his hand, crouching low as he pointed at a certain distance, muttering, "There's a Grogar hiding behind that tree. It has noticed us. As for its head, it is at the top of the branch, silently staring at us through a gap between some leaves." For a moment, Fielta shuddered in fear, for the scene was just too scary. After all, the Grogar's body was hidden behind the tree while its neck scaled up the tree's stem and rested its head on a branch, hidden from view. Moreover, this branch was at a height of 5 meters from the ground. This sense of disconnect and the way in which she was unable to spot the Grogar's head despite compass carburetor pointing at the location scared her. After all, it meant the Grogars were experts in camouflages. "What shall we do now?" Kaithai whispered, feeling mild fear as she said, "Its head is positioned beyond the range of my long sword. I can't hit it from here." "We'll wait for some time," Compass Carburetor said. "If we suddenly kill it, the other Grogars in the vicinity might be alerted. Considering the level of intelligence they possess, it is fair to assume this Grogar is a guard posted here. So, there should be another Grogar watching its position just in case of an ambush. We'll wait it out," he continued, "act like bushes. This is a game of patience. If we move haphazardly, we'll be detected." From the start, they had moved slowly, cautiously in preparation for such situations. So, that's why the Grogar hadn't attacked them despite noticing something amiss. Following his words, Fielta and Kaithai positioned themselves comfortably, slowly moving to arrive at the position. Beyond that, they waited in silence, watching the figure of Compass Carburetor slowly become still until his presence assimilated with the surroundings. It was appalling because even though they knew he was within the bush before them, they were unable to realize it while staring at him normally, as if there was a bush naturally positioned before them. How did he do this? Kaithai frowned, noticing many layers of mystery on Compass Carburetor. Fielta too wasn't any different. At the start, they had just assumed him to be a spoiled prince from a distant kingdom. But the more they observed his actions, the greater the veil of mystery around him thickened. "Compass Carburetor, just who exactly are you?" As for the person in question, he patiently observed the Grogar, staring at its head all along as time passed. 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, time continued to tick past while he remained still, observing the Grogar. They have the trait similar to snakes in that they can remain absolutely still. No wonder the Heroica Empire never bothered to hunt them. In this forested terrain, they are too dangerous. Slowly as time passed, the Grogar in question suddenly turned around, walking deeper into the forest as it seemed its shift time was up. Compass Carburetor signaled the two servants, moving immediately as they trailed after the Grogar, knowing very well that it was heading towards its home, which might very well be located within the dungeon or at least in the deeper parts of the forest nearby the dungeon entrance. This way, they needn't waste time roaming the forest in search of the dungeon. As the Grogar had completed its shift and was heading home, it walked at a slow pace. But, Compass Carburetor shuddered, noticing that even when it walked, it appeared to be perfectly still in his eyes, as if it wasn't moving. This is difficult. Chapter 73. Beginnings of the Secret Society, 11, you are listening at novelfull.audio. They neither made any sounds nor any abrupt movements, silently trailing after the Grogar. Fielta and Kaithai made mistakes at the start, but upon seeing how natural Compass Carburetor was in the environment, they imitated him, slowly becoming stealthier as time passed. Compass Carburetor noticed a couple more Grogars prowling about, heading towards the guard post that was now vacant. And all along, their movements were disorienting to his senses. After all, even when they moved in such natural pacing that his brain naturally omitted them. The human body was impressive in more ways than one could imagine. It was capable of perceiving a ginormous volume of information every moment. But, all it would do is overwhelm the brain quickly, causing the person to feel tired within a couple of minutes. To avoid that, it ignored most of the information, only processing what it deemed necessary. And, it followed a certain algorithm to do that. On Earth, cobras were capable of moving in a certain pattern that the human brain would gloss over their existence. Unless one was extremely alert and tried to look around, they might miss the cobra. It wasn't just the cobra, numerous snakes and reptiles possessed such a trait. They had naturally evolved to possess that to hunt their prey better. And now, the Grogar had the same trait. Moreover, it seemed theirs was even more advanced. After all, even when he focused on the Grogar, his focus was slipping away constantly as his brain was ignoring its existence, assuming it to be similar to the backdrop that needn't be focused upon. He had to constantly remind himself about its existence and blink continuously to not lose sight of it. As for Fielta and Kaithai, they struggled even more than him. In the end, they simply focused on following Compass Carburetor while trying their best to keep an eye on their surroundings. The trio paced through the forest terrain for a couple of hours, soon noticing the number of Grogar in their vicinity increase in number. It was apparent that they had reached a settlement of sorts where the Grogar lived. Compass Carburetor sensed 3 mental energy streams incident on him, motioning for the 2 servants to stop as they acted as bushes. Suddenly, his heart almost leapt out of his chest as he noticed a serpentine head slowly slithering towards him from the top of the tree. Only now did he notice the mental energy stream it emitted. It seemed this Grogar was resting atop the tree and had only now noticed the 3 bushes that had appeared mysteriously. So, its elongated neck descended like a snake as its serpentine head paused a meter before the bush at the front, staring at it with the calm eyes of a predator. Thump. Thump. His heart rate accelerated as Compass Carburetor felt fear while staring right into the serpentine eyes of the Grogar. For a moment, he had the impulse to summon his gun and shoot its brains out. But, he knew better to hold back. After all, the moment he attacked it, every Grogar in the vicinity would be alerted. There were more than 20 Grogar in the observable vicinity. He didn't know how many were hiding among the thicket of trees. So, he had to control himself and remain as patient as possible. Otherwise, their plan would fall short. Though, it was easier said than done as the serpentine head of the Grogar closed in even further, stopping right before his face. Compass Carburetor had to hold his breath to avoid alerting it. And, as time passed, it was getting more and more difficult to do so. After all, his opponent was calmly breathing while he had to hold his breath. And the emotion behind its mental energy stream was another reason he was losing his composure. Calm. Unfazed. That was all it felt while staring at the bush. It was apparent that the Grogars were stronger than the typical dungeon monster, despite only hailing from a level 1 dungeon. I'm not that weak. Compass Carburetor focused, calming himself down as he began to breathe out rather slowly, taking a minute to completely exhale and another minute to inhale. Even though it was tremendously difficult to do so, making his lungs feel like they were burning from the strain, he forced himself to focus. After all, his life and death depended on it. And before he knew it, an hour had passed as the Grogar judged that nothing was amiss, retracting its head. Compass Carburetor could finally relax a little as he noticed its head moving up and up the tree, stunning him as its neck seemed to be longer than 8 meters. Based on what he had learned from the late underground boss, the necks of the Grogars ranged between 5 to 8 meters. It shouldn't be longer than that. But, now that he witnessed something different, he realized that there was more to meet the eye than he had assumed. Right, the Heroica Empire dared not attack the Grogar, so not much is known about them. This might be the reason. It took them another hour to move away from that tree and hide behind one that was positioned 10 meters away. They had to move so slowly in order to avoid alerting the Grogars. Every time a Grogar noticed the 3 bushes, Compass Carburetor felt their mental energy streams, motioning for them to stop as they played dead, behaving like good old bushes. Throughout the entire night, it was a nerve-wracking session as they proceeded in such a fashion, coming close to a battle dozens of times. And every single time, they had to endure with patience, finally heaving a sigh in relief upon spotting a massive cave before them. With a single glance, they were able to determine that it was the entrance to the Grogar dungeon. Now, there were 2 Grogars stationed at the entrance as guards. And, unlike the other Grogars, the 2 of them seemed to be equipped with tougher scales. The scales partly resembled the exoskeleton chitin armor possessed by arthropods on Earth. Upon seeing them, Compass Carburetor mentally groaned, vexed, they even have exoskeleton armor. Just how troublesome can they get? Chapter 74. Beginnings of the Secret Society, 12. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Let me scout them first. Compass Carburetor said as one of his spy dragons slipped out of his clothes and slithered on the ground, hidden within the grass as it headed towards the dungeon gate. Thanks to its size and its unassuming appearance, it wasn't detected by the two Grogars that stood guard. Within a minute, it slithered behind them, crawling into the dungeon entrance from the corner. The moment it appeared on the other side, Compass Carburetor inhaled a deep breath in shock, muttering, "Beyond the entrance lies a cliff. It is around 10 meters in height." The spy dragon hid beside a rock, watching a Grogar walk towards the bottom of a cliff. Its neck then extended before coiling around a rock protrusion in the middle of the cliff. Its neck muscles convulsed as they tightened, lifting up its body before it reached the top of the cliff. The neck then uncoiled and returned as the Grogar walked through the entrance. So, that's how they climb up the trees. This level of muscle control is staggering. The neck muscles are strong enough to lift their entire body weight. That's interesting information. Compass Carburetor calmed himself. Thankfully, we didn't jump into the gate forcefully. We would have just fallen prey to the cliff and would have at least suffered a sprain, if not a fracture. The spy dragon then took on its flying form, crossing the cliff as it roamed through the place, getting an inkling as to the terrain of the place. An hour later, while sweating a little, Compass Carburetor sighed, finally finding a discreet cave where they could hide and operate in the dungeon. After ensuring that there weren't any Grogars along the path towards the cave, Compass Carburetor turned around, relaying his plan to the two servants. "It contains a certain level of risk, but the moment we hide after entering the dungeon, we'll be able to make way towards the cave that I have scouted." He then detailed the path and the distance they had to traverse, also informing them of everything he had witnessed through the spy dragon. "Even if we are discovered, there is a stretch of plains around the cave. So, if anything happens, we can easily defend ourselves. The Grogars aren't that much of a threat while on plains. We have greater range than their necks." Fielta whispered. "Let's go," Kaidai said as the three of them calmly moved forth, positioning themselves before the dungeon entrance. And right at this time, it was dawn as the morning rays of the sun were cast onto their surroundings. "Now." Upon his signal, all three of them jumped up, crouching while in the air as they protected their bodies as much as possible. Fielta wrapped her right arm around his hip while Kaidai did the same with her left arm. Compass Carburetor held a special armament that he had taken from the underground, activating the only state present in it. Immediately, a sphere formed around them before elongating on one side. The elongation was cylindrical in shape, elongating from the spherical surface of the sphere. The cylindrical part expanded to a length of 10 meters, its maximum height. And, positioned behind them was a tree with a thick trunk, onto which the cylindrical part collided, expanding to its maximum length. And, since the end of the cylindrical part was smooth, all it did was collide into the tree. And, due to its sturdiness, the tree trunk didn't break, barely caving in a little. And in response, when the cylindrical part expanded to its maximum length, it expanded in the opposite direction, causing the sphere around them to fly towards the dungeon entrance. The two Grogars were startled as the mass of energy in the shape of a lollipop flew into the dungeon by the time they managed to react. They hurriedly looked at one another, rushing into the dungeon to chase after whatever entity had barged into it. The moment the trio of Compass Carburetor and the two servants entered the dungeon, he retracted the energy blade, activating it once again as it pointed at the ground. The lollipop-shaped energy blade appeared as the cylindrical end touched the ground, preventing their fall as it tilted due to their momentum, causing them to pole vault towards the ground. Right before they crashed into the ground, Compass Carburetor retracted the energy blade as the three of them rolled on the ground, negating the momentum. They got up immediately as Compass Carburetor got up, raising his hands to point towards the incoming Grogar guards that leapt from the top of the cliff. Envy. Their heads moved towards the rock protrusion in the middle of the cliff, intending to use it to catapult their bodies towards the trio when Compass Carburetor shot at their heads, immediately noticing the extent of damage as he shot twice per each head. Fielta and Kaithai then activated their armaments, instantly hacking the two Grogar guards, attacking thrice before managing to kill their nimble opponents that possessed tough defenses. "Let's bury them," Compass Carburetor said as he took out his armament, with 3 states, and activated it, making a hole in the ground as he activated and deactivated it more than 10 times, creating an outline of a hole. Fielta then pointed diagonally downward, activating her armament as the energy blade pierced deep into the ground. The 3 of them then lifted the energy blade, lifting the layer of earth they had dug. Using his brute strength, Compass Carburetor kept the layer of mud propped up while Kaithai dragged the 2 corpses and pushed them into the hole. When Fielta deactivated her armament, the mud fell in the hole, burying the 2 Grogars within as Compass Carburetor appeared above it, activating the lollipop shaped energy blade as he used its force and added his weight to it, jumping on the place a couple of times as he used it to flatten the ground, erasing all the traces. Upon burying their victims, the trio sped through the path the spy dragon had scouted, hurriedly reaching the cave, gasping for air the moment they entered it. Compass Carburetor hurriedly pulled over the curtain of vines around the cave's entrance, covering it from view as he slumped on the ground, tired from the strenuous activity. "My hair might become white if I have to go through such situations all the time." Chapter 75. Beginnings of the Secret Society, 13, you are listening at novelfull.audio. Compass Carburetor took a nap, sleeping for 3 hours, getting up refreshed. The moment he got up, a weary Kaithai fell asleep. She had volunteered to keep watch while the other 2 slept. Now that he got up, she was unable to hold on any longer, falling asleep the moment she closed her eyes. Compass Carburetor took out some of the rations he had brought with him, eating it quickly until he had his fill. He was expending a lot of Darlak while moving the spy dragon, so he had to eat a lot to replenish himself. In the bags they had brought, it was mostly food and water. There were also some necessities like rope and a couple of other items. It was enough for them to be self-sufficient in the dungeon once their rations ran out. Compass Carburetor sent his spy dragon out, beginning to scout through the level 1 dungeon as he was stunned soon after, muttering, "Holy moly, just how long has this dungeon existed? There are too many Darble crystals lying around." In some of the places, there were enough Darble crystals like rocks on the ground. It was apparent that the dungeon had existed for too long for such a phenomenon to happen. If not for the fact that dungeons remained the same and never grew in size, this dungeon would have become many times scarier by now. Thankfully, it was still a level 1 dungeon, despite the number of years it had remained unrated. Now that he witnessed the sheer number of Darble crystals lying around, Compass Carburetor understood why the Grogars had established trade with the underground of Kettle City. To them, the Darble was a useless resource. For the next 2 days, all Compass Carburetor did was scout through the level 1 dungeon using the spy dragon, soon spotting a lone Grogar seated on what seemed to be a throne made out of a Darble crystal that had grown large enough to be used as its chair. This Grogar was different from the rest, sporting a body that was 4 meters high, a humongous figure. As for its neck, it was almost 20 meters in length, giving it a frightening appearance. Just its mere presence was suffocating to a certain extent. Dungeon Boss. Every dungeon had one. It was the leader of the dungeon monsters, capable of commanding them to do its bidding. And in a dungeon raid, the humans targeted the dungeon boss first. Once it was killed, the monsters would lose their leader and no longer form armies. With that, it would be easy for the humans to hunt the monsters on a daily basis without any risk of a dungeon break happening. And, the moment another dungeon boss appeared, they would notice the signs in the changing behavior of the dungeon monsters and swiftly organize another raid party to exterminate it. A dungeon boss was the strongest of its species in the dungeon. And, the bigger the dungeon, the stronger the dungeon boss. That was why, to kill the dungeon bosses of level 2 or level 3 dungeons, an entire army would have to be sent. They'll use a multitude of siege and other heavy weapons to spam attacks on the dungeon boss first to weaken it. After that, they would make the puppets fight the dungeon boss, inflicting injuries on it steadily while working on tiring it. After all, only when all the Darlac in the Darbal crystal growing on its forehead was expended would it tire out. And, a dungeon boss had a tremendous reserve of Darlac. Finally, the warriors would swarm it and attack it non-stop using their energy blades. Despite everything, they would have to suffer tremendous losses since the dungeon bosses would make all the monsters in the dungeon swarm the army. It was a race against time, a quest to see which party would emerge victoriously. And, the life and death of the dungeon boss signified everything. Taking on a dungeon boss was that risky. Though, Compass Carburetor had no intentions to fight it. He was aware that even if he emptied all 6 of his bullets into its head, it wouldn't die. After all, the dungeon boss's body was protected by a tough chitin armor. It had surpassed a rhinoceros in toughness. Let's see, who else is stupidly powerful apart from the dungeon boss here? Compass Carburetor thought, causing the spy dragon to roam through the dungeon as he spied upon every Grogar in the place, finally smiling upon seeing a lone Grogar. Based on the similarity in its suffocating presence, this Grogar is one of the dungeon boss's offspring. Thankfully, it's a female. Compass Carburetor thought, laughing as he finished planning, out of the 3 offspring, only one is female. And, all 3 of them are equal in power. But, they pale in comparison to the dungeon boss. The one he set eyes upon spanned a height of 3 meters and had a neck length of 15 meters. But for his plan to fruition, she had to become even stronger. The female Grogar simply stayed in place, using her long neck to climb up a tree to pick up a fruit that she munched upon. Based on what he had observed, the Grogars were omnivorous. They ate anything that was deemed edible. On seeing that she simply remained idle in her spot, the spy dragon slithered out, soon scouting through a couple more locations as Compass Carburetor looked through the places where high-quality Darbal crystals grew. Upon motioning for Fielta and Kaithai to remain in place, he exited the cave, moving carefully as he spent a couple of days collecting as many Darbal crystals as possible, choosing ones that had the highest of quality among those he saw. Eventually, he had gathered a large enough pile, enough to fill up an entire bag's worth as he returned to his cave, resting as he went through his plans once. He then motioned for Fielta and Kaithai to pick up as many of the fruits that were the female Grogar's favorite while he did some preparations, selecting another cave that he deemed was secluded enough. A day's worth of preparations later, he sighed, calming his thumping heart, I hope this works. Otherwise, I'll be screwed. Chapter 76. Beginnings of the Secret Society, 14, you are listening at novelfull.audio. Fielta and Kaithai hid in a discreet location situated at the edge of the dungeon, peeking through a small hole they had created. They stared at a cave's entrance that seemed discreet enough. After all, seated within was Compass Carburetor, holding a bag filled with Darbal crystals that he had selectively picked up. Also piled at the corner were more than 200 fruits that the female Grogar liked to eat. Each fruit was the size of a muskmelon, so they formed a large pile. Appearance, smell and taste were almost similar to a muskmelon, so Compass Carburetor addressed them as such. The only difference was the fact that these muskmelons grew on massive trees in contrast to their creeper variety on Earth. Finished with his preparations, Compass Carburetor sent out his spy dragon, causing it to fly towards the location where the female Grogar resided. Upon arriving at the location, he noticed that she was the same as before, immobile in her seat while occasionally eating the fruits that grew within her neck's reach. Suddenly, her eyes darted towards the spy dragon that openly flew in her surroundings, making wavy arcs in the air before landing on a tree branch. It then opened its mouth, unleashing its energy blade that was a meter in length, shaped like a needle, poking a hole into the tiny branch connected to a muskmelon. The tiny branch was severed as the muskmelon fell on the ground, cracking open from the impact. The spy dragon landed on it, unleashing its energy blade once again as it pierced through the muskmelon, behaving as if it was sucking the melon's pulp like a mosquito. Having never seen such an interesting creature before, the female Grogar was slightly curious. She simply observed the spy dragon, watching it fly away after some time had passed. Her curiosity ignited, the female Grogar got up from her seat and steadily followed the spy dragon, watching it dart from one tree to another, soon heading towards a patch of grass situated before a cave. On the patch of grass was a muskmelon, one that appeared tastier than the rest, oozing out a pleasant aroma. The spy dragon buzzed around it for some time before landing on the muskmelon, piercing its energy blade through it to act like it was drinking its pulp. And, entranced by the smell, it seemed like it had let down its guard as it failed to sense the female Grogar that had arrived right behind it. Seated within the cave, hidden by the curtain of vines was Compass Carburetor, noticing his hands faintly tremble at the Darlac expenditure. After all, he had created a pitfall and had been covering it with his energy blade that had been created after activating both the long sword and wide sword of his armament. The energy blade had pierced through the ground to remain stable. And atop it, Fielta and Kaithai had prepared their trap. But, he didn't deactivate it the moment the female Grogar arrived at the spot, waiting patiently until most of her attention was on the spy dragon. As her head moved towards the spy dragon, Compass Carburetor deactivated the energy blade, alarming the female Grogar as she fell into the pit, suffering injuries when the spikes within pierced through her body. Her body was riddled with a lot of injuries. Though, they weren't life-threatening thanks to the exoskeleton armor protecting her from most of the damage. Though, the blood loss would become dangerous if left untreated. Even after suffering so many wounds, the female Grogar didn't even flinch, calmly treating it as an accident as her neck exited the pit, intending to lift her body out. Hopefully, this works. Compass Carburetor thought, taking in a deep breath as he calmed his thumping heart. He was feeling jittery, anxious even. After all, he was wagering his trump card on something that may or may not work in the situation. And even if it worked, he may or may not be able to reap the benefit he sought. But, this would push my plans by many steps forward. I'll soon obtain enough means to combat Regreal if this works. Thinking, Compass Carburetor focused on his mental energy form, activating his trump card. System Fragment, Slave Harem, Level 1. One of the bullets in his gun was replaced by a bullet that was the condensation of the ability of Slave Harem, Level 1. And now, Compass Carburetor took in a deep breath, mentally firming himself as he aimed his gun towards the pit, carefully aiming as he waited patiently. The moment the head of the female Grogar peeked out, he made a shot, noticing the bullet hit his target right in the face. There was no damage inflicted as the bullet simply seeped through the female Grogar's head instantly, vanishing as Compass Carburetor could feel a connection of sorts form between him and her. But, he remained in waiting, realizing that he would need at least a couple of seconds or more for the effect to stabilize. After all, the mind of the other party had to be affected by the system fragment. And, the moment he felt a mental energy stream filled with affection appear from the pit, Compass Carburetor sighed in relief, understanding that his ability had indeed taken effect. He immediately sensed the rate at which the power within it was being expended. Great, I have a month before the effect vanishes. That should be enough for my plans. He then walked out, watching the neck of the female Grogar form a hook on the ground, lifting her body vertically as she landed on the ground. She then stared at him in silence, causing him to feel awkward as he was unsure as to what might happen next. Compass Carburetor was hesitant as he extended his hand a bit, fearing that the opposite party would simply bite it off as he gently touched her head, sighing in relief upon seeing that his hand remained intact. Thankfully, it worked. He then noticed her bleeding figure, motioning for her to follow him as they entered the cave. Chapter 77. Beginnings of the Secret Society, 15, you are listening at novelfull.audio. Now for the most dangerous part. Compass Carburetor gulped, nervous as he gazed at the female Grogar from top to bottom, sighing as he picked up a muskmelon, motioning for her to eat. The female Grogar liked muskmelons the most anyway, and since she needed to heal her injuries, she opened her mouth and bit onto the muskmelon, crushing it into pieces before swallowing it in one gulp. But, what she hadn't known was the fact that he had placed many darble crystals in its center. This way, when she ate the muskmelons, the darble crystals would smoothly pass through her neck and land in her stomach. For this to happen, he only selected tiny darble crystals with the greatest quality. He indeed spent a lot of time foraging for them throughout the dungeon after all. Using the influence from Slave Harem, Level 1, Compass Carburetor made the female Grogar eat beyond her fill until her stomach bloated to the limit. He then allowed her to slump at a corner and rest while he tended to her injuries, using the materials he brought to patch them all up. And, while the female Grogar rested, he fed her muskmelons filled with darble crystals constantly, always maintaining her in an overfed state. The injuries weren't deep, but thanks to the care Compass Carburetor exhibited, he could feel the connection between them deepen. This was part of his plan. What he wished to achieve was her remaining as his ally even after the system fragments effect vanished. And until then, he planned to deepen their connection as much as possible. By the end of the third day, the female Grogar had eaten enough to the extent her digestive system was at its limit. If she didn't empty her bowels, then her sphincter might burst. Upon sensing it through the mental energy stream, Compass Carburetor nodded, saying, "This should be enough." He then condensed his gun, focusing on his second and final trump card as he switched a normal bullet with it. System Fragment, Body Resurgence, Level 2. He shot the system fragment into the female Grogar, noticing it seep into her body like before. Immediately, the female Grogar twitched in pain, unable to endure it. Even she wasn't able to remain unaffected under the burning sensation of her body being fried alive in boiling oil. Her body thrashed around in pain when Compass Carburetor held her hand, expressing his support silently. Through their connection, the female Grogar was able to feel his intentions, silently enduring the pain as she could feel her strength subtly increasing. As a dungeon monster, the offspring of the dungeon boss to boot, she was stronger than she let on. So, she was aware of the changes, looking at Compass Carburetor in a new light, immediately causing the emotion of gratitude to bulge in the mental energy stream. Through the myriad emotions in the mental energy stream, those that continued to become deeper and deeper as time passed, Compass Carburetor understood that he was slowly becoming an important individual in the female Grogar's mind. That wasn't all, it seemed just the fact that he stayed by her side while she experienced pain triggered her feelings. And under the effects of Slave Harem, Level 1, they were tremendously magnified, causing all the emotions to penetrate the depths of her mind. While observing the changes happening in real time, Compass Carburetor sighed, "I have zero right to mock Regreal. This is a simple contest for power, nothing more, nothing less. That's the only reason I am hunting him. There is no sense of justice or a sense of responsibility involved here. The only one I am responsible for is Stencil's safety." He firmed himself, trying his best to remain steady while withholding the billowing sense of disgust in him. He was still somewhat able to stomach manipulating people through lies. After all, that was simply him using his intelligence and experience to achieve. People were affected by numerous things. And, all he did was affect them in such a way it favored himself. This was something every human did voluntarily or involuntarily. So, he never felt repulsed while doing that. But, what happened here indeed repulsed him. After all, he was forcefully changing the core of a being against their will, changing their inherent self. Such an action disgusted him, despite the target only being a monster. Killing was fine. After all, for him to eat meant a life had to be killed, whether it was a plant or an animal. That was the most primal law of survival that every living being had to abide by. But this wasn't something he was equipped to mentally deal with. But still, he persisted through, preventing his actual feelings from being displayed in his actions, mannerisms, and on his face. He expressed care for the female Grogar, watching her body's bulge reduce slowly. Body resurgence, level 2, was more potent than what Rigreal had used at the start. Moreover, unlike converting flesh into Darlak, the ability was affecting the Darbal crystals in her body, Darbal that was the purest form of energy condensed by the body. So, the effect was many times greater. For a human, this wouldn't have been possible. After all, human bodies never condensed a Darbal. But, every monster with a certain level of accumulation possessed a Darbal crystal on its forehead. And, the stronger they were, the bigger the crystal. The female Grogar had a Darbal crystal spanning 5 centimeters before. But now, it began to grow in size, also improving in quality as all the Darbal crystals in her stomach were being consumed by the ability at an alarming pace. Soon, she began to feel an intense sense of hunger as Compass Carburetor noticed it through the mental energy stream, feeding her more muskmelons. Of course, all of them contained Darbal crystals in the center. What he had thought of was an insane plan. But, as the root of the operation were the two system fragments, abilities of a system that operated at laws beyond the scope of the world's logic, it was doable. There was no strongest ability, but only the strongest person. And, depending on the user, even the simplest of abilities would produce alarming results. And, Compass Carburetor was the definition of that, gazing at the monster that was growing tremendously as a result of his actions. Chapter 78. Beginnings of the Secret Society, 16, you are listening at novelfull.audio. Time passed in such a fashion as all the female Grogar did was eat and suffer in pain continuously, non-stop. And by the end of a week, Compass Carburetor sensed that the effect of body resurgence, level 2, was beginning to wane out. He hurriedly fed the female Grogar the last remaining muskmelons, watching all the energy be broken down as the quantity of Darlak in her body magnified once again while the length of the Darbal crystal on her forehead had reached 30 centimeters. Just this factor was a simple indicator of the fact that the female Grogar was now the strongest of her species. After all, even the dungeon boss only had a Darbal crystal that was a length of 20 centimeters. Finally, when her body reached a height of 5 meters and her neck a length of 30 meters, the effect of body resurgence, level 2, ended. Had he used the system fragment on himself, he would have only obtained a fraction of the results. The fact that a dungeon monster was capable of growing a Darbal crystal on its forehead played a major role. Adding onto it were the innumerous Darbal crystals he had fed the female Grogar. Had he tried the same on himself, he would have simply died from poisoning. It was a result brought about by a difference in physique. The moment the effect ended, the female Grogar groaned as she got up, feeling a cool sensation pervade her body as the burning sensation vanished. Moreover, she was able to feel the tremendous power coursing through her body, also able to notice that she had grown larger, bigger than her father. She then gazed at Compass Carburetor, the source that granted her strength. Her neck coiled around him while her head gently rubbed itself onto his face, expressing her affection. Compass Carburetor didn't resist, patting her neck gently with a wide smile. He was overjoyed too. After all, his plan had turned into a success. What he had hoped to achieve while expending the only 2 system fragments he possessed had turned into a success. Had it failed, he dared not think about what he would do with himself in regret. After all, he had plotted a lot against Rigreal to even obtain those 2 system fragments. And, he had no guarantee of being able to achieve it again. Everything rode on this plan. And now that it was a success, he shed tears of joy, thinking, now, I have a powerful ally to support me when I explore Mohart Dungeon. The female Grogar's powers slowly stabilized as she let go of Compass Carburetor and exited the cave, hissing at the top of her voice, suddenly causing a stir throughout the dungeon. Every Grogar within heard her voice, rushing towards her immediately. Some of the Grogars alerted the ones outside the dungeon, transmitting the signal throughout the forest as all the Grogars rushed into the dungeon, sprinting towards the female Grogar. And among them was the dungeon boss, clearly able to feel its control over the Grogars slipping away as a new, stronger entity had emerged. Even though it felt waves of discontent, it realized that even it was falling under the influence of the new ruler. And when it arrived before the female Grogar, it was unable to resist anymore, bowing its neck with a subservient pose. And right as this time, its control over the Grogars completely vanished, announcing the arrival of the new dungeon boss, one that was even stronger than itself. The female Grogar's neck elongated to its limit, standing in a straight line. All the Grogars too did the same before they unleashed a collective hiss, causing a cacophony of sound waves that reverberated throughout the dungeon and echoed numerous times. Fielta and Kaithai witnessed the scene, shuddering in fear as the hair on their limbs stood erect while goosebumps appeared on their skin. The scene of the Grogars standing while keeping their necks vertically erect slammed into their minds, triggering their sense of alarm, fear, and anxiety. Suddenly, the female Grogar hissed many times, causing all the Grogars to do the same, repeating the action more than 10 times as she bent her neck, moving it into the cave as it paused before Compass Carburetor, making eye contact, staring constantly. Ack! All of a sudden, Compass Carburetor screamed in pain as his vision blanked out. For, a sea of mental energy streamed into him, overwhelming him to the extent his mental energy from was on the verge of crumbling. Anthozoa absorbed everything, converting it into his mental energy as it flowed through the circuit, gushing into every item representing his skills. Dexterity, level 8. Dexterity, level 10. Stamina, level 7. Stamina, level 10. Intelligence, level 7. Intelligence, level 10. Cognition, level 9. Cognition, level 10. Natural Recovery, level 6. Natural Recovery, level 10. Arms, 2. Arms, 6. The development he had planned to attain within a year happened all of a sudden. Among the sea of mental energy, more than half was from the female Grogar. Barely regaining his consciousness, Compass Carburetor was able to feel that the mental energy stream from a dungeon boss was tremendously different from others. After all, what she expressed now was subservience. And hence, something from deep within the dungeon, a mysterious substance that was behind the creation of dungeons gushed into him through the mental energy. After all, the act of the dungeon boss and every single dungeon monster, Grogar, belonging to the dungeon exhibiting a singular emotion of subservience towards him seemed to have triggered this phenomenon as the body of the money-making system in him reached peak development while absorbing this mysterious substance, fusing together. Suddenly, Compass Carburetor screamed even further as his brain whirred into life, thinking to the limit before his mind shut down. And during this time that spanned less than a couple of seconds, he had condensed a tremendous reserve of mental energy, created from his memories that gushed into the gun. Within a dozen seconds, every single Grogar fainted from an over-taxation of their minds as the ocean of mental energy gushed into Compass Carburetor. Everything fused together into a whole, turning into a concept that had become his representative, a manifestation of his lies that had now become reality. A symbol. Chapter 79. Establishment of the Secret Society. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Arg. Compass Carburetor woke up a couple of minutes later, screaming upon getting up, noticing the figures of tens of thousands of Grogars lying on the ground, fainted. But, just when he was about to think of what had happened, he noticed something within him had changed. Just to save time, he pulled up his status screen, flabbergasted upon seeing the changes. Name: Compass Carburetor, Domino Platopia, Race: Human, Spirit, Physique. Health, Level 10, Strength, Level 10, Dexterity, Level 10, Stamina, Level 10, Intelligence, Level 10, Cognition, Level 10, Natural Recovery, Level 10, 5 Senses, Level 10, Resting, Level 10, Personal Fragment. Anthozoa, Secret Society, Arms. 6 Arms, Benov calm. What the heck happened? Compass Carburetor was confused as realization hit him. All the information related to the changes floated across his mind, allowing him to understand as he smiled wryly, looking at the change in his name. Guess I can also be addressed as Domino Platopia now. If I had known this, I would have used a decent name. He then massaged his forehead. Is that what they say? That if you lie enough, it becomes the truth. To think I would obtain a personal fragment here, even though every system slayer is only supposed to have one. And, it's named Secret Society to boot. Though, upon seeing just what this ability was capable of, Compass Carburetor was unable to determine whether he had to laugh or cry. After all, it was a rather troubling ability that could be dangerous if he abused it. The danger didn't lie in the ability itself, but him. He was afraid that if he used it too much, he'll become too arrogant for his liking. There was a solid chance that it might get to his head. Let me see if it is possible. Sighing, Compass Carburetor approached the female Grogar, activating his personal fragment, condensing a symbol that was a double C that were joined tangentially. The moment the symbol appeared in his hand, he could feel a stream between him and the female Grogar, a connection of sorts that appeared green in his eyes. Similarly, he gazed in the direction Fielta and Kai-Thai were hiding, noticing two red streams between them. Red means they aren't subservient/devoted enough to me. Green means they are subservient/devoted enough. He then gently placed it on the head of the female Grogar. From today onwards, you'll go by the name of Duchess Platopia. The symbol immediately seeped into the female Grogar, turning into a tattoo on her head, vanishing after a couple of seconds. And now, he was able to feel a solid connection between them. The connection wasn't one created by Slave Harem, level 1, but through his personal fragment, Secret Society. The essence of Secret Society could be described in one word, cult. All in all, using the symbol, the so-called worshippers of Secret Society could pray towards him. And in this way, they could transmit their thoughts to him in the form of prayers. And when deemed fit, he would be able to answer the prayers. This was basically a communication channel established between all the members. Though, all communications should pass through him. If needed, he could appoint a person in charge, his representative that was able to intercept all prayers and reply to them. This was just one of the uses. The second use was the sharing of abilities in the form of bestowal. But, this only worked in one way. When someone prayed to him, he could bestow them one of his skills, either temporarily or permanently. Though, he could retract them as he deemed fit. But, only he was able to bestow them to the followers of Secret Society. Moreover, not only were his skills included in the bestowal, but even his Anthozoa. Though, the gun they could use would only be the normal Anthozoa and not the one like his where it contained laws of the earth. Basically, it wasn't effective against systems. Only his Anthozoa was capable of injuring a system's body. The third use was a meter of devotion towards him. The more devoted they were to him, the more of his abilities was he able to bestow them. Moreover, if someone's devotion towards him reduced below a certain level, he was able to inflict a curse upon them. The curse wasn't anything spectacular. But, all it did was erase all of the individual's memory of the Secret Society and anything related to it. As it was called the Secret Society, it in essence operated the same, secretive in its means. So, only the members were able to remember anything related to it. The final use was the symbols themselves. The members were able to make the symbols appear and disappear as tattoos on their bodies. And, this was by far the best mode of identification that involved the greatest of secrecy and could never be found out. After all, only members of the Secret Society were able to see the symbol. No one else was capable of seeing it. It bordered on a level of mystery, truly making Compass Carburetor the essence of his lies. He had been personified into the character depicted in his lies. Whether it becomes a force of justice or a cult all depends on me, huh? He sighed, I just hope I don't become drunk on its power. But still, he barely reined in his excitement, this gives me the power to go toe-to-toe with the slave harem system. He then sensed his mental energy form, thinking, all my skills have reached the peak at level 10. My arms have also grown to their limit of 6. Now, I can hold 6 system fragments at a time. This speed of growth is stellar. I wonder what Fourth would feel once he sees the current me, But, considering my current mental energy reserves, I can barely create 4 symbols at a time. So, it would take me some time to make every Grogar a member of secret society. He thought, laughing, this is great, tremendously great. He clenched his hand into a fist. Since I can travel worlds, it means I can return here in the future once again. I'll be able to use the secret society to hunt any systems that appear in this world. Chapter 80. Devotion Meter and Ability Bestowal. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Compass Carburetor expended the remainder of his mental energy to create 3 more symbols, placing them on the previous dungeon boss and its 2 children. With this, he obtained the elites of the Grogar under his command. Compass Carburetor then focused on the devotion meter, converting it into simple numerical units, determining the values as he thought, for every 10 units of devotion, I can bestow them a skill. Similarly, if they had 100 in devotion, I can bestow them my Anthozoa. But, if they only had 100 devotion, then I can either bestow them the Anthozoa or 10 skills. He then looked at the previous dungeon boss, calculating the devotion it felt towards him, around 14 devotion. They need a minimum of 10 devotion towards me for my secret society to be effective on them. He then thought, bestowing it intelligence, level 10, as he spoke, from today onwards you'll be called Denthor. Denthor slowly woke up upon receiving the bestowal, bowing as a set of words resounded in his mind, I greet Lord Spirit. Telepathy. Compass Carburetor thought, realizing that this was the communication method available to the members of secret society through the form of prayers. Though, they were only able to communicate with him this way. Now that he was addressed as Lord Spirit, he had to get in character as Compass Carburetor nodded, replying through the telepathy, I bestowed upon you greater intelligence. Use it for the good of this society. Gladly, Lord Spirit, Denthor said while bowing its neck a bit. Compass Carburetor then focused on Duchess, the female Grogar that was now the dungeon boss of the Grogar dungeon. He decided to address it as the Grogar dungeon because it was more or less his personal place from now on. And, he was surprised to see that Duchess had around 127 devotion. It was a stellar sum. Compass Carburetor immediately sensed the devotion of the other 2 children of Denthor, figuring out that they had devotion in the 30s. So, Duchess is special thanks to the effect of Slave Harem. Compass Carburetor nodded, understanding that all the effect of Slave Harem, level 1, had now been converted into devotion towards him. So, it was better this way. A bestowal didn't require any contact. From anywhere in the world, he could do it to his members. And, for bestowing a skill, he hardly consumed any mental energy. But, to bestow Anthozoa, he had to consume a significant sum. I'll bestow it upon her later. Thinking as such, Compass Carburetor arrived before the hiding place of Fielta and Kaithai, saying, it's done. Who, the heck are you? Kaithai frowned, feeling that it was getting harder and harder to make sense of him and his actions. Due to being in character, Compass Carburetor smiled, guess. Upon seeing Kaithai frown, he waved his hand, saying, this is a power available exclusively to the royalty of the Platopia Kingdom. And, we are bound by a vow to never divulge the details. So, even if I wish to speak about it, I'm unable to. That's the reason I told the both of you to never ask whatever I do from that point onwards. The result you have to care about is whether or not I would be able to free General Artica. Fine, I won't press forth any longer. Kaithai sighed, feeling a headache as she calmed herself, still reeling from the effect of the scene she had witnessed. The fact of every Grogar lining up before the female Grogar that had grown mysteriously in size and power was alarming on its own. But then, all of them had suddenly shouted to their limit before fainting in unison. So, whether she wished to or not, Kaithai was unable to make sense of anything that had happened. But, she now realized one thing after seeing the actions of the previous dungeon boss. Compass Carburetor was in control of the situation. Compass Carburetor sensed intense doubt, suspicion, and resignation from Kaithai's mental energy stream. As for Fielta's mental energy stream, there was only fear in it. Yes, fear. Even though she still maintained her usual poker face, the emotion she was experiencing was one of fear. It was a complete contrast to her previous emotion of affection towards him. As time passed, Duchess woke up. And eventually, all the Grogars woke up one after another. Fielta and Kaithai had returned to the cave to remain in hiding, unwilling to be discovered by the Grogars. Even they had no hope of surviving in such a situation. Once all the Grogars woke up, even though they felt tired, they looked at him with a different look now, causing a gentle stream of mental energy to gush into him. All Compass Carburetor did was stand in place, absorbing the mental energy until he had enough to bestow Anthozoa to Duchess, informing her about her name. Though, the moment she received Anthozoa, Duchess consumed a tremendous amount of her Darlac reserve, causing her body to morph as she turned into a human, shocking him. How? Compass Carburetor looked at her in shock when he realized that camouflaging oneself into the same race as him was part of the power present within the symbol itself. Though, it required a tremendous amount of energy, Darlac, to do so. Upon turning into a human, Duchess had lost most of the power that she possessed in her Grogar form, except for her Darlac reserve. The moment she turned into a human, she expressed a bashful smile, gently covering herself as she bowed, transmitting a message through telepathy, "It is my honor to serve you, Lord Spirit." Compass Carburetor also bestowed her the skills of intelligence, level 10, and cognition, level 10, saying, "Try and see how it works." "Yes, Lord Spirit." Duchess beamed in a smile as she focused, causing the symbol to activate on her arm as she condensed the gun in her hand, aiming it towards the wall in the cave as she took a shot. The bullet landed on the wall, making a hole as Compass Carburetor smiled. He then gave her some instructions, causing Duchess to throw the gun towards the wall, making it disappear right before it crashed into the wall. She then materialized it in her hand once again, performing most of the actions he did while wielding it.